Warning: the following content may contain graphic or mature material. Viewer discretion is advised. In 1965, 16-year-old Sylvia Likens was sent to the home of a family friend, Gertrude Banisevsky, while her parents were traveling. But only if she knew what horrible things await her.
Banisevsky was convicted of the 1965 brutal torture and slaying of a neighbor's child, 16-year-old Sylvia Likens. The girl was bludgeoned, scalded, tattooed, and starved by Banisevsky and her children while she lived in their home. Banisevsky was sent to prison for life. Banisevsky's request for an early parole from prison outraged victims' rights groups throughout the community, who said she should never have a second chance.
Sylvia Likens' parents were both carnival workers and were therefore on the road more often than not. They struggled to make ends meet as her father Lester had only an 8th grade education and a total of 5 children to care for. Jenny was quiet and withdrawn with a limp from polio. Sylvia was more confident and went by the nickname Cookie. In July 1965, Lester Likens decided to take up with the carnival again, while his wife was jailed for shoplifting that summer. Sylvia's brothers, Danny and Benny, were put into the care of their grandparents. With few other options, Sylvia and Jenny were sent to stay with a family friend named Gertrude Banisevsky. Gertrude was every bit as poor as the Likens and had 7 of her own kids to support in her rundown home. She made little cash by charging her neighbors a few dollars to iron their laundry. She'd already been through multiple divorces, some of which resulted in physical abuse against her, and dealt with a crippling depression through heavy doses of prescription drugs. She was in no condition to take care of 2 teenage girls. The Likens, though, didn't think they had any other choice. Lester Likens cryptically requested that Banisevsky straighten his daughters out when he placed them in her care for $20 a week. For the first 2 weeks at the Banisevskys, Sylvia and her sister were treated kindly enough, though Gertrude's oldest daughter, 17-year-old Paula Banisevsky, seemed to butt heads with Sylvia often. Then one week their father's payment came in late. Gertrude spat at Sylvia and Jenny. She grabbed Sylvia by the arm, dragged her into a room, and closed the door. Jenny could only sit outside the door and listen as her sister screamed. The money arrived the following day, but the torture had just begun. Gertrude soon began to abuse both Sylvia and Jenny in broad daylight. Though a frail woman, Gertrude used a heavy paddle and thick leather belt from one of her husbands who had been a cop. When she was too exhausted or too weak to discipline the girls herself, Paula stepped in to take her place. Sylvia, however, soon became the focus of the abuse. Gertrude Banisevsky demanded that Jenny join in, lest she take her sister's place as the brunt of the abuse. Gertrude accused Sylvia of stealing from her and burned the girl's fingertips. She took her to a church function and force-fed her free hot dogs until she was sick. Then, as punishment for throwing up good food, she forced her to eat her own vomit. She allowed her children, in fact, encouraged her children, to partake in the abuse of Sylvia and her sister. The Banisevsky kids practiced karate on Sylvia, slammed her into walls and onto the floor. They used her skin as an ashtray, threw her downstairs and cut open her skin and rubbed salt into her wounds. After this, she would often be cleansed in a scalding hot bath. Gertrude gave sermons on the evils of sexual immortality while Paula stomped on Sylvia's vagina. Paula, who herself was pregnant, accused Sylvia of being with child and mutilated the girl's genitals. Gertrude's 12-year-old son, John Jr., delighted in forcing the girl to lick his youngest sibling's soiled diapers clean. Sylvia was forced to strip naked and shove an empty Coca-Cola bottle into her vagina while the Banisevsky children watched. Sylvia was so beaten that she was unable to use the bathroom voluntarily. When she wet her mattress, Gertrude decided that the girl was no longer fit to live with the rest of her children. The 16-year-old was then locked in the basement without food or access to the bathroom. Gertrude spread every story she could imagine getting the local kids to join in on the beatings. Gertrude told her own children that Sylvia was a prostitute. Then she had Ricky Hobbs, a neighborhood boy, and her 11-year-old daughter Marie carve the words, "I'm a prostitute and proud of it," into her abdomen with a heated needle. At one point, Sylvia's older sister Diana attempted to see the girls under Gertrude's care, but was turned away at the door. A neighbor had also reported the incidents to a public health nurse who, upon entering the home and not seeing Sylvia, for she was locked in a basement, concluded that nothing was wrong. Banaszewski had also managed to convince the nurse that she had kicked the Likens girls out the house. Neighbors allegedly were aware of how Sylvia was abused. They had seen Paula strike the girl in the Banaszewski home on 2 separate occasions, but claimed not to report the abuse, and the abuse of Sylvia continued. Gertrude forced Sylvia to write a note in which she told her parents that she'd run away. Sylvia was also forced to write that she'd met up with a group of boys and given them sexual favors, and afterward, they'd beaten her and mutilated her body. Shortly after this, Sylvia overheard Gertrude Banaszewski tell her children that she was going to take Sylvia to a forest and leave her there to die. A desperate Sylvia Likens attempted one final escape. She managed to get out the front door before Gertrude caught her. Sylvia was too weak from her injuries. With the assistance of a neighbor boy named Coy Hubbard, Gertrude beat Sylvia with a curtain rod until she fell unconscious. Then, when she came back to, she stomped on her head. By the morning of October 26th, Sylvia was unable to either speak intelligibly or correctly coordinate the movement of her limbs. Gertrude moved Likens into the kitchen and, having propped her back against a wall, attempted to feed her a donut and a glass of milk. She threw Sylvia to the floor in frustration when Sylvia was unable to correctly move the glass of milk to her lips. She was then returned to the basement. In an attempt to wash Sylvia, a laughing John Banaszewski Jr. sprayed her with a garden hose. Sylvia again desperately attempted to exit the basement, but collapsed before she could reach the stairs. In response to this effort, Gertrude stamped upon Sylvia's head before standing and staring at her for several moments. Shortly after 5:30 p.m., Richard Hobbs returned to the Banaszewski residence and immediately proceeded to the basement. He slipped on the wet basement stairs and fell heavily to the floor of the basement to be confronted with the sight of Stephanie crying and cuddling. Sylvia emaciated and lacerated body after she had been ordered by her mother to clean Sylvia. Stephanie and Richard then decided to give Sylvia a warm, soapy bath and dress her in new clothes. They then laid her upon a mattress in one of the bedrooms as Sylvia muttered her final wish that her daddy was here. When Stephanie realized that Sylvia was not breathing, she attempted to apply mouth-to-mouth resuscitation as Gertrude repeatedly shouted to the children in the house that Sylvia was faking her death. Sylvia was 16 years old when she finally succumbed to her injuries. Gertrude Banaszewski initially beat Sylvia's corpse with a book, shouting, "Faker, faker," in order to rouse her. However, she soon panicked and instructed Richard Hobbs to call the police from a nearby payphone. When police arrived at her address at approximately 6:30 p.m., Gertrude led the officers to Likens' emaciated, extensively bludgeoned, and mutilated body lying upon a soiled mattress in the bedroom before handing them the letter she had forced Likens to write previously by her dictation. She also claimed she had been doctoring the child for an hour or more prior to her death, having applied rubbing alcohol to Sylvia's wounds in a futile attempt at first aid before she had died. She added that Sylvia had earlier run away from her home with several teenage boys before returning to her house earlier that afternoon, bare-breasted and clutching the note. Jenny, though, took her chance. As soon as she could get close enough to a police officer, she whispered, "Get me out of here and I'll tell you everything." The police arrested Gertrude, Paula, Stephanie, and John Banaszewski, Richard Hobbs, and Coy Hubbard for murder. Neighborhood participants Mike Monroe, Randy Lepper, Darlene McGuire, Judy Duke, and Anna Sisko were also arrested for injury to person. These minors would blame Gertrude for being pressured to partake in the slaughter of Sylvia Likens.
Radio Indiana, WIBC, Indianapolis.
Parole in a 20-year-old murder case. And this is WIBC News. May 1965, when 16-year-old Sylvia Likens was tortured to death by members of the Baniszewski family, with whom the child was staying while her parents worked with a traveling carnival. When the case broke, Paul Page was our anchorman, and the late Bob Hoover, our street reporter. The following is an excerpt from a 1965 newscast in which Bob Hoover spoke with Richard Hobb, who explained what he did to the girl.
All I did was write that thing on her stomach, and then I hit her about 10 or 15 times.
But how come?
Well, mostly because Gertie told me to.
Hoover then spoke to one of the Baniszewski children, who told him how the victim was treated.
She refused food. We tried to give her soup every once in a while and stuff like that, and she wouldn't take it.
Well, how about these scratch marks on her stomach? Who put them on her?
I did.
Why?
Well, Gertie just thought of it. She said, since you branded us, we're going to brand you. So she etched it in with a pen, and I went over it. She showed me how to do it, and then I went over it. I did it.
Did you ever use any hot irons on her?
No. Yeah, that 3 on her stomach, I did half of that, and Shirley Ann did the other half.
Where'd the S come from?
What do you mean?
There's a big S branded on her stomach, right below one of her breasts. Huh?
That's what I'm talking about.
Well, that's what you're talking about. Now, how about the inscription on there, I'm a prostitute and proud of it? Who put that on her?
I did.
Did you scratch it on there, paint it on there? How'd you do it?
Well, like I said before, Gertie wrote it down there with a pen, and I did the rest. She showed me how to do it, and then...
Had Gertie abused this girl?
Yeah.
Gertrude Baniszewski, however, had a different story.
I did never beat that girl. Never. She was beat up on by other girls. In fact, my own daughter socked her in the jaw and broke her wrist. And so, I mean, there you go. And girls around the neighborhood beat her up, bloodied her nose. One girl broke her nose, in fact, I think.
Were you ever in contact with the police on any of these occasions?
Well, in the last 2 weeks, in fact, I think if you talk to my daughters, I'd ask them the children's father and I are divorced. And he's a policeman in Leech Grove, or was. And I've asked the girls repeatedly to call their dad and ask them what to do. And in fact, I asked Jenny, I said, Jenny, and I told Sylvia, I said, Sylvia, I'm going to have to call the police or somebody because I can't have the responsibility.
But the police were called only one time. And according to Hobb...
Well, I'll come in and about, she come up from the basement, and we noticed she was cold and everything, so we carried her upstairs, give her a warm bath and artificial respiration. When she stopped breathing, we gave her a warm bath, and then she stopped breathing. And so I gave her artificial respiration for about 10 minutes. And then I went and called the police.
By the time police found the girl, she had been dead some 8 to 12 hours.
Gertrude herself pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. She's not responsible, her defense attorney told the court, because she's not all here. There were several more children involved who proved just too young to be charged. Ultimately, though, on May 19, 1966, Gertrude Baniszewski was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. She was spared the death penalty despite her own lawyer admitting that, in my opinion, she ought to go to the electric chair. Paula Baniszewski, who had given birth to a daughter during the trial, was convicted of second-degree murder and was also sentenced to life imprisonment. Richard Hobbs, Coy Hubbard, and John Baniszewski, Jr. were all convicted of manslaughter and given 2 to 21-year prison sentences based on the fact that they were minors. The 3 boys were all paroled just 2 years later in 1968. Gertrude spent 20 years behind bars. There was no question about her guilt. The autopsy backed up everything Jenny told the police. Sylvia Likens had died slowly and painfully over several months. In 1971, both Gertrude and Paula were retried to the result that Gertrude was again found guilty. Paula pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of voluntary manslaughter and was sentenced to 2 to 21 years. She once even managed to escape despite being recaptured. After about 8 years behind bars, Paula was released, and she moved to Iowa, where she changed her name and became a teacher's aide. She was suspended from her position when, in 2012, an anonymous caller tipped off the school district that Paula was once convicted of the death of 16-year-old Sylvia Likens. Gertrude Baniszewski was granted parole on good behavior on December 4, 1985.
But in September, the parole board voted to give her that chance. Then protesters collected 40,000 signatures objecting to her release and staged a memorial funeral procession to Sylvia Likens' grave. The wave of protest persuaded a judge to vacate the earlier parole decision and order today's extraordinary hearing before the public.
If you turn Gertrude Banaszewski loose, you might as well put me in prison, because I would be in prison in my own home, afraid to go anywhere by myself again.
Banaszewski told the parole board she's a born-again Christian. She burst into tears when asked to talk about her crime.
I can't do it, and I'm sorry. That's all I can say. And I ask him to forgive me. That's all I can tell you.
Once again, the board voted 3-2 to let Banaszewski go.
The bottom line, you cannot bring someone who is dead and gone back to life. And I wouldn't be a member of this board if I didn't believe people could change.
Banaszewski will be released soon, as she already has a place to stay, a new job, and a new identity, so she can try to lead a normal life. Edie Magnus, ABC News, Indianapolis.
The only relief Jenny received came 5 years after Gertrude's release, when the murderess died of lung cancer. "Some good news," Jenny wrote to her mother with a copy of the woman's obituary. "Damn old Gertrude died. Ha! I am happy about that."